On behalf of AIHS and Art of Work, welcome to today's insightful conversation about COVID-19, emerging from lockdown, applying what we have learned. My name is Mark McLaren and I'm a member of the Art of Work team. During today's webinar, you'll be able to make comments and ask questions through the YouTube live chat function on your screen. I will hand you over to Kelvin to get the conversation started.
Welcome. This is webinar number 6 in our series on COVID, a partnership between the Australian Institute of Health and Safety and Art of Work. Today, we're really privileged to have some of the leading thinkers in safety and governance that are working today. We've got Professor Sidney Dekker, who heads up the Safety Science Lab for Griffith University and is the architect of Safety Differently. And Michael Tooma, Managing Partner Australia for Clyde Co, and I would say the architect of Law Differently for Safety. And Rosa Carrillo, who has joined us from the US and is really the architect of Relationship Differently. And I think what Rosa has done is introduce some really interesting ideas about the importance of relationships in the workplace and the way that we interact with each other. So today is a discussion and an exploration of what we have learned coming out of COVID. And I'm going to now hand you over to that discussion and seed the discussion with the panel members. So firstly, welcome everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kelvin. Wonderful to be part of this esteemed panel. And I should declare that I've already given the instruction that I will change my business cards forever now to be architect of Law Differently. I love it.
Yeah, I was also going to mention that you're the legal disruptor, Michael.
I like that.
I didn't want to hand across my title to anyone else. So yes, so thanks for joining us. And in setting up the nature of this discussion, clearly COVID has had an extraordinary effect on everything that we think about in the way that we work, our communities, and also our consciousness as such. And in that, there's a lot of things that have been done that have improved maybe some of the things that we think about and work and interact, and there'll be things that are creating some conditions or constraints that we need to be wary of. So I'll just hand it across to the panel to share their thoughts firstly on what has been the most significant interaction or effect in your minds that the COVID experiences has had on organisations.
Yeah, thank you, Kelvin. I might get the conversation started and be keen to get the input from my esteemed panel members. For me, what COVID has done is it's exposed a number of fallacies and myths in relation to both how work is done and how work is regulated. And there are really 5 themes that emerge from this for me. The first one is that it's amazing how few of the rules that we have in the workplace are actually based on actual laws and obligations. Because if you reflect on it, all of us have, for example, working from home rules and things around setup of desk space and rules in relation to housekeeping and all of those wonderful things. In some workplaces, how to hold a hot mug when you make a cup of tea, and all of us use those rules to kind of ridicule some of the bureaucracy that has gone on in safety. But now all of those rules have been removed. All of a sudden, none of them exist. And if one was to do a compliance check against real legal obligations in any jurisdiction around the world, I would challenge you to actually find where the origin of those rules actually are in laws. So it's kind of demystified some of those myths around, we need to have this safety procedure or this other safety procedure because the law requires it. In actual fact, that's been proven not to be the case. And a related point, I think, to that point is how few of those rules are actually necessary. Do I really actually need guidance around whether hot water is in fact hot? Do I really need a set of procedure if I decide that after my long hard day working from home, I'm going to fire up the barbecue and put on a barbecue for my family, and building on that, how all of us have managed to survive without that guidance and those rules. In other words, that we're all actually smarter than the safety community gives us credit for.
Michael, I think it's more than I think it's more than surviving.
Yeah,
I actually would claim that we've been thriving with
I like it.
And
I
so,
agree with that.
Yeah. No, I think this is a key point, and I know you've got more myths that need to be dismantled, but within the misconceptions that have been laid bare, I think relentlessly and mercilessly in the crisis. We have also seen emerge amazing capacities within people to actually do the right thing, to capitalize on their freedom within the frames that are still there, right? 50 kilometers from home, whatever it is, you can see mom under these conditions. And so within that, we actually, because we're all in it together, because we have a common frame and a common goal and a common enemy, if you want to put it that way, in a very sort of jingoistic American way, we seem to be willing to comply without having been compelled in any way by safety people to do so. So the people do the right thing. They come up with local solutions that work for them, that lead to safe and even better outcomes. And so I think, but I'll just park this on the shelf, and then you go back to the because I'm eager to hear the other three. But I think what we really need to bottle from this experience, right?
I wanted to add to that because I was on a call with people in the healthcare, and I mentioned that we were talking about drift, and I said everybody has had to drift in order to deal with the COVID crisis because there was nothing. Yet everybody's still based on the belief that it was the rules that were protecting us.
So powerful, Rosa.
People. Right.
I think people. There's a risk here, guys, that people will take the wrong messages out of this, right? That they'll think that actually people lecturing us in relation to what needs to happen and telling us that these are rules was the turning point. Actually, to me, the turning point in relation to compliance was people bringing us into their confidence and saying, this is how this virus works. And these are the reasons why we need the guidance that we have. So please come along on that journey. And whenever we deviate from that, whenever we start to say, oh, actually, we put out directions that are internally inconsistent, or we'll get into the minutiae of, only 4 people in a room, and 5 people at a wedding and 10 people at a funeral, and kind of get into that level of prescription, we lose people along the way. I'd be interested in your comments around some of that. But
I think, Michael, it's a good observation because people have actually been critical of the silliness of some of the rules. In that space, and hence, really haven't played that game. And I think what's really interesting over this process is the way that organisations and society has continued to function well, given all of the constraints that have been applied upon it. And I think the reason for that, the fact is, we are going to the supermarket and there is food on the shelves. There is medicines in the pharmacies. There is trucks delivering all over the place. There's been manufacturers are functioning. I've been really amazed about the amount of adaptation that people have been able to do if you look at the constraints and the rules that were put in place, it really suggested in the first place there was very little you could do other than sit in your house. And that's not what occurred. Is people have taken that into place. And I'm really interested in terms of this adaptive capacity is how have people then, and Michael, I've heard you make this statement a number of times, it's been really interesting how businesses have actually engaged and solved these problems that are in place. So I'll put that back to the group.
And if you're trying to tell this story right now, you'll be forgiven for thinking that it's the strict enforcement of rules that has helped us. Made it so, right? Yeah. If you actually, when time passes and people look back at this period and write history with a bit of research and a bit of objectivity, what they'll find is most businesses reacted themselves ahead of regulation. Yeah. And protected their workforces appropriately, and that is, I think, I'm sure there are exceptions to that, and I'm sure that people focus on those exceptions. But on the whole, what you would say is that most corporations reacted appropriately, and did so by applying what has now become the rules. If you can work from home, work from home. If you can't work from home, provide certain controls in place to minimise the risk of the spread of the virus. And businesses, for the most part, did that without the need of the rules. And in fact, one could argue that the rules got in the way because they started to confuse people. Am I supposed to be open? Am I not supposed to be open? Can I serve customers in a retail setting? Am I not allowed to? Should people be congregating outside of my store? When the worst of the economic impact of this occurred, and there are large queues outside of the government agencies in charge of handing out welfare payments. There was a clear disconnect that people couldn't go to the beach, but they could line up in close proximity to each other outside the government agency. Ask yourself, what's the logic and science behind that? For a long time, there was a debate in Australia, Rosa, that you may not have been aware of, but schools are safe, but the same kids in a park playing together are somehow unsafe, and then there is an internal disconnect and logic and logical, well, illogical aspect to those mixed messages. And whether that's right or wrong, actually the intervention of loads of rules, I don't think helped us in this debate. It detracted from our ability to manage the risk ourselves.
Sidney, safety definitely leads organisations to engage people as a solution to harness rather than a problem to control. And in terms of engaging in that, organisations are encouraged to think about autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And I think this builds upon what Michael has just been saying.
Oh, very much so. Well, the issue with any crisis is that you can always write these two histories, right? I mean, the one history is exactly the one that Michael illustrated, that the strength of our ability to deal with the crisis comes from pushing initiative to the points of action, right? Mm-hmm. And allowing it to flourish there and deal with local situations as they emerge and develop and unfold. The other story and history that gets written after crises is a story of strong leadership, right? And you see this, in fact, in the last 150 years. Those leaders who get elected are the ones who lead a country successfully through crisis. Those who lose their jobs in politics are those who end up being on the receiving end of a recession, right? And this is pretty predictable. It's a pretty predictable pattern. Now, but I think what Michael beautifully illustrates is that hierarchical top-down control can never keep stable the complexity and the uncertainties of actual work or life on the front lines, because it becomes internally contradictory before you've even tried, as you illustrated beautifully, right? There is simply complexity science would explain beautifully and even mathematically why this is so, but I think it's intuitive, right? The sheer volume and the sheer diversity of what happens in the world, in your country, in your park versus school is too much to keep stable in the head. The thing is, it was always so. It was always so. It's not as if this is something, oh my God, this is completely new. No, this is what we've been saying all along, right? So this goes back to Michael's very first point. It's now being laid bare, right? And it's not unique to COVID. It's not unique to this particular crisis. It was always so. We've always deluded ourselves with the notion that we can lock uncertainty down, that we can rule uncertainty out, that we can ban uncertainty from the world by writing yet another rule. It's bull. It doesn't work that way. And if we haven't recognized that from the current situation, we need to have more webinars.
I love you to express Sydney, and I thought I might.
This is kind of a minor example, but when Michael was talking about the rules, I thought in one of the things in the healthcare industry that has really been difficult is to get the staff to wash their hands. There's all these.
Sure, yeah, 35% compliance rate. You know, by those who want to measure it. Yeah. Whatever that means.
Now here we are washing our hands 20 times a day, you know? Yeah. You have to have a reason, a purpose, a motivation, as opposed to, you must comply.
A hierarchical imposition. Yeah.
Beautifully put. Beautiful. So I couldn't agree more.
So this is our opportunity.
It is.
Crisis creates the opening. And I don't know if you're familiar with Naomi Klein. She's an economist.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. She wrote the shock doctrine. And she said,
I know. Yeah.
When we have that shock, all these possibilities are open, and things that were never possible before suddenly become doable. And we've seen some of those things during the COVID, right? Letting people make their own decisions, be autonomous, be creative, be adaptive, work from home. I had a manager who said, I've been having so much trouble with this employee because he's not productive. Oops, he's unproductive. Is that my computer making that noise?
You're fine.
Okay.
Keep going.
They're not productive, and working from home, she's the star employee.
Yep.
So that makes us rethink about the work environment. What are we doing wrong in the work environment that we're actually stifling people from doing their best work?
Well, but before we answer that question, though, Rosa, I think, and this is where I want to go back to Michael's 3 remaining points, or whatever they were, but is
right.
I don't think, notwithstanding, I think the scholarly, the moral, and the empirical value and superiority of the point you just made, I don't think we should underestimate for a moment the hysteresis in organizations and cultural systems to deflect back to solutions that seemed to have worked for them, which was to write more rules, to lock down uncertainty, to impose constraints from the top down, to organize things hierarchically. This hysteresis will be very strong, notwithstanding what you just said. And I think it would be really useful for us to help people who are on the webinar identify some of the signals that seem to suggest that the organization is once again reverting, right, and giving into that hysteresis to go back to old ways.
Sidney, I'll touch in there because I think we've already seen one of the first signals coming out from Safe Work Australia and Safe Work New South Wales, who have just issued, a whole lot of instructions about, operating in the COVID environment, and it seems to be emboldening the process. Right, we need to think about structure and process and rules. I don't know whether you or Michael got any observations, about those signals and how we should treat them.
I've never seen a controversy that I haven't bought into. So let me start. I've got to be on brand, guys. Got to be on brand. There's an interesting debate that is playing out at the moment between Safe Work Australia and the union movement. Safe Work Australia is saying the right approach in relation to a post-COVID return to work arrangement is the guidance that we have put together. The union movement is saying we need new laws because we need to ensure that by propagating new laws, we can protect workers. it probably wouldn't surprise anyone on this call, knowing me, they're both wrong with respect to them. The reality is that we actually, the existing rules are not adequate for a post-COVID environment, but not for the reasons that the union movement is articulating. The reason that the existing rules are not, as in the laws, are not adequate for a post-COVID environment is because there are too many of them. And a lot of them are actually not risk-based at all. There are a lot of procedural and administrative requirements that in the new world, you actually couldn't possibly comply with in a way in which it is designed. And one of the points that has emerged from this is actually if there is a role for the safety regulator in relation to health and safety enforcement, don't they need to know if there is a COVID incident so that they can actually take an interest in and investigate it? And the rules on that are not clear. I mean, what you would need is something other than the actual event, which would be hospitalization, for example. So you wouldn't be notified of the actual incident. You'd be notified, when it has turned, bad. There would need to be some other trigger in the actual reporting requirements, and then you overlay that with a whole bunch of requirements that are not fit for purpose, that are rather designed for loads of inspections. Well, if you think about a risk-based approach to consultation that engages in inspections and checklists type of mentality, what you end up with is actually exposing more people to risk, not less people to risk. So we have been on this journey for some time of actually taking a long, hard look at whether our rules, in fact, are fit for purpose in the sense that they actually live up to the hype of being truly performance-based, being outcome-based, being giving people what we as a group talk about, freedom within a framework. And there's a lot of rhetoric around that. But in actual fact, what you end up with is a combination of both. Yes, operating rules, which are basically about the duty of care, and then on a few hobby issues that have historical context, loads of administrative requirements that overload the system and don't actually add a great deal of value necessarily from a health and safety outcome perspective. And if you're looking for evidence of that, I challenge the people on this call to read through all of the requirements in relation to consultation. Now, let me say this before people jump on the Q&A and hurl abuse. I always welcome it, but on this occasion, I'll just cut it off in this way. I am not saying that worker engagement is a bad thing. In fact, I'm saying the opposite. What we need is proper worker engagement. We actually need a bottom-up approach. Yep. What I'm saying is that the bureaucracy of what is touted as worker engagement is not worker engagement at all. No. It's just bureaucracy. And not achieving the purpose of the objective of actually engaging, getting insights from workers in relation to how work is done, what are the challenges in relation to getting work done, what are the things that, and we talk about this as a group, what are the things that make work hard, what are the things that make work easy, and how do we lean into those things? Because that's the real conversation we need to be having, not a conversation about, do we have enough fire exits and are they unblocked and have we done enough inspections and, can we have the minutes of the last meeting, please? Those things, with respect, don't really add a great deal of value in relation to the safety outcome.
Thanks, Michael. I might pass across to Rosa, because you've now, in touching on the consultation piece, you're touching on engagement and relationship in organisations. And Rosa, I'd be interested in your observations about now how what we've learned in COVID and the experiences we've had have changed the way that we think about relationships in our workplaces, and what should we be taking forward into the emergent COVID world. Rosa,
Sorry, there we go. I had to unmute myself. There's a huge range of issues there, all the way from the larger social, the economic crisis that we're in. People have lost their jobs. Many we lost family members. So there's a great deal of pain, and there's this whole workforce that were considered essential workers, that in a sense are low-paid workers that are asked to risk their lives. So all of this has created for the U.S., I don't know how it is where you are, but it has created a great deal of negative lack of trust, and especially with our political party, lack of transparency. So I think that the leaders of our organizations have been sensitive that our country's leader did not fill, which is to provide a clear plan, a direction, right? And to look at some of the ways that people can continue working and remain safe, because look at the meat industry. People don't want to go back. They're saying, yeah, we're essential workers. Basically, you're saying that we should die. We should be willing to die. So these are pretty deep relationship issues, and the way that I've seen some companies have treated their workers very fairly, and people talk about that. They say, they're probably going to be loyal till the end because they feel they got the protection they needed. If they needed, time off, they got paid. And there's this whole other group that are laid off. They're just, they're not considered essential, and so they're let go. And then you ask those people, how are you going to absorb those people back into the workforce? I think this is going to be a huge challenge for safety professionals, for leadership really, but safety professionals always have the brunt of these negative downturns because of the low trust and the attitudes that people have towards management and the company, right? So that's the area where I've been working, which is consulting with leaders about how to manage, their communication and managing the uncertainty during this COVID, and then not assuming that when everybody comes to work, they can just go back to normal. They can't.
Yeah, I think, Rosa,
I don't know. We need to talk about what that's going to look like.
Yeah. As we go back to work, and part of the assumption is as we sort of particularly do this emerging from lockdown, that we just simply need to apply the rules that we've already got, like social distancing, for example, and apply that in the workplace. And that seems to fail to recognise that that's going to be quite a difficult challenge in many workplaces. The simplicity of a lot of work, and if you want to observe what happens in many workplaces like the meatpacking construction sites, even in healthcare, even in our office space where we're going to have to congregate and take lifts up into our offices, it won't be as simple as just saying there's a simple rule to put in place and it will all work. It will require some sort of adaptive. So I'm just interested in the panel's views that about this simplistic view, of what the process will be when we emerge to work, and how we're going to actually bring that into practice, into work and adapt to that environment.
It's always interesting to, sorry, Michael, it's always interesting to see if you set this along a larger historical arc, you can see that for the last 150 years, there has been a tendency, particularly in Anglo cultures, surprisingly, to revert back more to hierarchical control and rulemaking to manage these sorts of uncertainties. 1870, I'm talking, the U.S. sent two of its officers to study the Prussian military system because they'd become quite fascinated by what the Prussians already at that time called Auftragstaktik, right? It took until the 1930s for the Americans to finally find a label to translate that, and they screwed it up. They called it mission command. And in the US, mission command was always confused with better bureaucratic ordering, more bureaucratic efficiency, better ways in which you get stuff from the top to the bottom and back up and back and forth along the hierarchy. That's never what the Germans or the Prussians intended it to mean. Right? Auftragstaktik is the sense of giving your local leaders, right, or even people who aren't leaders but take up a leadership responsibility, the freedom, the liberty within the frame of particular objectives and other constraints to achieve the objective. But you're not going to tell them how to do it, right? And I think we have shown beautifully in this crisis that people are perfectly capable of doing this. Right? If the mission is stay healthy, don't get COVID, and I fully agree with Rosa that there are configurations in our political economy that make it impossible for some people to do that because they are sacrificial for various reasons, and ultimately the cost and the destruction of a crisis like this will find its way along the break lines, along the fissures in society that run on poverty and race and economic inequality, and that was always so as well. You go back to the Middle Ages and you see the same thing with the plague, for example. So that's not new. But what's fascinating is that 150 years after Anglo first starts dabbling in these other ways of structuring and giving people freedom within a frame, you still get it wrong. You still say we need to give people more rules to do these things. But what we fail to understand is that, and again, I'm not saying they figured it out altogether, but the Prussians understood that you need three things in your people for this to work, right? You need knowledge. They need to know stuff. So yes, you got to give them some knowledge about how this thing transmits, how the immune system responds, whatever, right? So give them some knowledge. The second one is you got to give them the independence. But the third is you have to look for what the Germans beautifully called the Verantwortungsfreudigkeit, the joy at taking responsibility. Right, and you can celebrate this. You can give it to people, and making sure that you imbue these values in your people, I think, will lead to good outcomes. Right, and let's not confuse the recovery with indeed the word recovery, because you don't want to recover back to where we were. No. Let's understand this as resilience, right? An increase in adaptive capacity, taking us to a new place, a better place. Michael, sorry.
No, not at all. I'll piggyback off some of your comments, which were right on point. I mean, in a sense, we are in a battle on ideology. Just picking up on some of the what Rosa has said, and what we've seen work through this process is the more trust you give people, the more information you provide them, the more honest conversations you have. Even difficult conversations, but they're honest conversations that say, well, for in those circumstances, we as a society cannot afford for these jobs not to be done. So we're going to do the best that we can to put controls in place. Then you're bringing people along on the journey of understanding why, in their case, these are their circumstances, as opposed to someone else who has the luxury of working in an office environment who simply gets to stay at home and work at home. Even difficult conversations around that we're currently having about whether certain tasks are really necessary. And I was going to pivot that to make this comment. I think the most positive thing that has come out of the COVID-19 crisis and the lockdown is it's allowed us to not only rationalize the rules, but also reflect on how many tasks are really, truly necessary, and whether the way we are doing things is the only way to do things. And if we think about the hierarchy of controls, elimination is the top of the hierarchy of controls. There's a whole bunch of tasks that we are doing just to do them. There's a whole bunch of counting that we do just to count. There's a whole bunch of audits that we do just to do audits and feel good about auditing. Beyond safety, there's a whole bunch of administrative tasks and repetitive tasks that have been eliminated through this process, and the world has not caved in. The economy has not caved in. One of the things that we need to do when we go back, which in some jurisdictions is imminent, is reflect on whether we need to necessarily go back to normal, or whether there is a new normal which has a number of ways of doing things differently. Reimagining work in a way that is more efficient, that provides more autonomy to people, that actually reflects the reality that we have exposed a number of tasks to actually be redundant in our system. The second thing is that, consistent with the hierarchy of controls, we know that businesses went to isolation here very quickly. That government went to isolation very quickly, as in, and not just in isolation as the language we talk about in relation to COVID-19, but actually removing people from the risk by asking them to stay at home or to engage in what's been termed social isolation techniques, to actually remove them from the risk of exposure. Now, I hope we remember that lesson when we go back to work and apply it across a number of risk areas, and not just immediately forget it and go straight down 2 runs down and look for administrative controls like safe working procedures, like training, instruction, and information, and other useless things. Sorry, did I say that out loud?
No, you did. We'll edit the we'll edit later.
Please don't. It was deliberate.
I think there's one key pivot point that's come out of what each of you have said is a connection to purpose. And what we've been able to do with COVID, if you want to frame this in this way, what COVID has been good for is giving us a common purpose and a focus on the purpose and the objective. And that's allowed to happen what Sidney, and Michael, you both talked about. It then says, well, let's revisit this thing and focus on what we're trying to do and work towards that objective. So I think that could be one of the lessons to take forward is how do you keep that focus on purpose when the purpose isn't COVID, going through and apply the same insights, Michael and Sidney, that you've given. Sidney, I think I found it was wonderful that you found the guidance for our leaders coming from the Prussians and the Germans, and so modern leadership, is it's always worth revisiting history, to find some of the answers. But I think we've talked a bit about leaders and we talked about regulators to some degree and a range of other things. Is there any insights that we should be providing to our safety professionals in this post-COVID world? Because they're always the meat in the sandwich. They're between the pressures that come from the unions and the workers, and you've got pressures from leadership and pressures from regulators. What should they be doing differently in this emergent world?
Well, it picks up my next point, which is the fourth point in my five points that I wanted to make at the outset. One of the things that this crisis has exposed, Kelvin, Sidney and Rosa, is that a lot of our rules are actually biased towards the things that we can see immediately, and the things that happen frequently. COVID, if nothing else, I mean, there's examples of a pandemic, is quite clearly a high consequences, low frequency type of event. We would not have anticipated this sort of thing happening in our workplaces, although you would have thought that threat of contagion, given SARS and everything else has gone on before, would have given us a clue to actually be prepared for some of those things. The reality is that many workplaces were found not to have been ready for it, and they've shown adaptive capacity and full credit to the ability to pivot and do that. But it's exposed the reality that actually we create our safety procedures and systems for what we see. And what we see is the stuff that happens all the time. And that happens to be the low consequences, high frequency events. So there's a real bias around that. And one of the opportunities to reflect for the safety professionals is recalibrating that. Actually reflecting on whether that should be the purpose, the approach, whether in fact you should relax some of the requirements in relation to those events that are kind of lower in the consequences order. Trust people more in that, and focus your energies on things that have those higher consequences. And you mentioned regulators, and I wanted to bring on the last point because I'm really interested in the panel's view around that. One of the things that people mistakenly interpret in relation to the Safety Differently, the Safety 2 movement is this perception that actually what people like me want is there would be no rules or no laws or no regulations. I want you to reflect on what's occurring around us. The reality is that as soon as you signal to a regulated community that there is some limitation in your ability, whether you're OSHA or HSC in the UK or one of the safe work authorities in Australia, there's going to be some relaxation in your engagement and enforcement of the rules. The pressure to prioritize safety comes off. And fundamentally, if you are going to apply a functioning, strong, and effective freedom within a framework approach, you need the framework to be very diligently enforced. Because of the framework, if those boundaries that we're creating are not enforced, if they're lax, then what you're describing is ultimately anarchy. And sadly, we're starting to see the consequences of that at the moment around the world, but particularly because of the COVID numbers. We know that they're not COVID related necessarily or directly COVID related in Australia. A large number of recent incidents, fatal incidents, and major incidents that have occurred in the last month or so that reflect, in fact, what might be the sign of things to come. Now, no doubt, mindfulness is a factor here. People are distracted. Disruption of supply chain is a factor here because things are not their norm, and all of those things will play a part. But it's actually the focus of businesses to ensure that people have the resources they need when they need them, and the means to do the work safely requires for that strong role of a regulator in relation to the important rules, the rules that set that framework.
Thanks, Michael.
I want to add or ask your opinion, Michael, because you use the word enforcement because we have, and I understand, there's this framework, and then you have the autonomy to operate within the framework, which I really like. But I think that reliance on regulators for that enforcement might not be feasible. And the reason goes back to how relationships operate, the social systems in the organization operate, which is that you're basically supervised by your social norms and the expectations around you. You're not supervised by the regulators on a minute-by-minute basis. So if we are going to create these frameworks, then we really have to look at, and this is why I'm saying this is an opportunity for us. The crisis is an opportunity to rethink how we are educating and training our workers, which is to give them the skills so that they can create those boundaries consciously and realize what their role is in reinforcing those. Sidney earlier said that self-accountability is one of the hallmarks of this working, right? But self-accountability only comes after people's social needs are met. Do you respect me? Do you include me? Do you value me? Do you recognize me? So that whole aspect, and that's what my book is about, because that whole aspect of education is missing from the safety professional education.
Sidney, any observations or comments into just what's just been said?
The misconceptions that safety differently or safety 2 would indeed, as Michael says, would be a movement against rulemaking and certainly against government rulemaking. it's a strong misconception, and it is unfortunate. And I think Rosa adds some real important points to that too. But if you look at the more nuanced versions of the debate and the scholarship around this, it is actually, it takes aim more at how free markets create more rules and more nonsensical rules because of a variety of factors, including the sheer fact that we now have a market for more safety bureaucracy where individual little companies can come up and help you write a bigger SMS than you actually really need. Making lawyers like Michael make people really afraid, so they have lots of legal protections and liability management in order to. But you see where I'm going, right? And
the only correction I'll make is not like Michael.
Not like Michael. So people unlike Michael, exactly. Colleagues that are not like Michael make boards really afraid and anxious for liability claims, and so they overcompensate with all kinds of stuff that the regulator never asked for. In fact, I would be the first to say that the past 40 years of market-oriented policymaking in the West, and particularly Anglo countries, and the neutering and emasculation of regulatory authority and capacity has been a bad thing, because the markets have made up for it and overcompensated with lots of nonsense of themselves, which actually doesn't protect workers well, right? As the incidents that Michael alluded to, as Rosa illustrates. And as Michael was commenting on the high visibility and high frequency, but low consequence events, we protect them against that sort of nonsense, right? Which anybody. So the argument is far subtler than that. Now, if you go back to Rosa's point, work from the 1970s, Rolston and others who look at how kinship relations and other workplace relations were actually responsible for imbuing people with a particular set of values that they coordinated and rallied around. There was no need for safety rules, right? They were able to create safe outcomes on the basis of those relationships. Would that we have the capacity now to once again, back to what Michael was saying, give people the confidence and the trust to rely on those relationships, to develop those relationships, to entrust those relationships and value them, so we get the outcomes we all want, and that cannot be imposed from the top down.
And if I give you an example, Sidney, a lot of what drives this kind of culture comes out of the question you ask. Let me illustrate. If someone came to me and said, I in my private life drive a car. Is it possible that I could go to jail for driving a car? The answer is yes. If you are negligent and in your driving, you could be liable for all sorts of traffic offences.
Hang on, I just want to say, if you are found negligent, negligent is an attribution about behavior. There is no such thing as negligent behavior, right? It doesn't fit a psychological textbook. So if you are found negligent, sorry, go ahead.
If you're found by court to be negligent, and then there is all sorts of traffic offences that apply. And in fact, if that negligence is so gross that it would fall in the category of recklessness, right, a more serious category of negligence, and you're found to have been reckless in that context, you could go to jail for manslaughter for driving a car. Now, are you going to write any different rules or behave any differently, or shift your risk profile as a result of that piece of knowledge? Well, the answer for all of us would be no. I am very careful and cautious in the way that I do it. I do it because I don't want to kill anybody while I'm driving, and for the most part, that makes sense to me. I'm not going to alter my behaviour with that piece of knowledge. Now, you overlay that to the debate in relation to things like industrial manslaughter, for example, and all of a sudden you've got huge reactions to penalties that apply to extreme behaviour. That if you sat down with someone and said, would you engage in that kind of behaviour? They would say, well, no, hell no, I wouldn't engage in that kind of behaviour. No, yet we have an extreme pivot and overreaction that reflects that, and that seems to be illogical, emotional reaction to the legal framework that applies to health and safety offences. And that drives a lot of the debate around whether it's fair or right that there be penalties in that order. But everyone who argues in relation to that point wouldn't engage in the sort of conduct that would warrant that kind of penalty. So what I say to people is that this is largely irrelevant. I wouldn't write the rules for that risk. I'd be looking at how do I protect my people, and how do I make sure that people are not seriously injured or killed at work, and how do I create the boundaries that we're talking about, the framework that we're talking about for that. And to pick up on Rosa's question, I think it's a very astute question, and agree with her wholeheartedly. For the most part, workplaces are unregulated because it's not feasible for the regulators to get to enough workplaces to have any meaningful impact. For the most part, the regulation of safety, despite all the talk of proactivity, is an entirely reactive event. An incident happens that has the consequences that we're talking about, and a regulator is therefore moved to attend to that incident and investigate it. So the best form of legal protection, legal risk management you can adopt, and you've heard me say this many, many times, don't have the incident in the first place. That is the best legal strategy you can adopt. You don't have the incident in the first place. And I'm not talking about that don't have incidents, because you will have incidents. What I'm talking about is don't have a fatality, a serious incident that causes serious injury, or has that quite clear potential as an explosion, that those major events. If you steer your system towards preventing those, rather than preventing the low consequences events that we're discussing, or in some businesses, suppressing those events, not actually dealing with them, but just suppressing the reporting of those events, openly or covertly, through incentives and cultural pressure, then you will have better outcomes from a legal perspective, from a safety perspective, and from our overall functioning perspective. And the sort of ingredients that go into that are the stuff that Rosa's talking about, which is building trust, engaging with people, getting to understand why people are not able to do the work as you imagine it to be. Getting that insight. They're not out there trying to flaunt the rules because they're flaunting the rules. Their reality is different what you imagine it to be. And so rather than think in theoretical terms, you've got to gain and systematically gain that insight, which is takes us back to the engagement debate. The engagement debate shouldn't be about how do I create a process for engagement. It should be how do I institutionalize this idea of a workforce up approach rather than a management down approach.
So we're about to move into open forum questions, and I might just get a very quick response from each of the panel members. Is as we've taken all of this on board, we've been going through the COVID experience. What would you like to see as the future state of workplaces as we've come out of COVID? What would be the attributes you would like to see? So Rosa, I might start with you.
Okay. Well, this feeling of we're all in this together has been one of the most positive aspects of this experience. The social connections with friends and family and my colleagues also. There's been, because people have more time for conversation or also writing on LinkedIn. There's been some fantastic conversations that people have been having. And you can see that people have been deeply impacted. For example, on some of the sites with the safety professionals, they're talking about how this is the first time that senior management has engaged them and invited them to the table. And so that's another opportunity for us. We say crisis brings opportunity. That's another opportunity. How do we maintain that sense of urgency that safety and health belongs at the table, not be consulted after we make all of these decisions? And if you're only consulted about rules, you're missing a whole aspect of what it really takes to have a safety and health community that holds itself accountable. So I would say that would be my dream, would be to have safety and health professionals have a seat at the table and to maintain we're all in this together.
Thanks. Sidney?
My ideal would be to see that the curiosity that I think we would want to impart to people, for them to want to understand how this could go right, how this could go well, what the adaptive capacity on the various front lines was in order to actually make stuff happen. Not come with a judgmental mindset, not come with a framework of rules, but come with a curiosity. How did they actually make this work?
Yeah.
And I think that once you start discovering that and be relentlessly empirical about this, right? Just want to find out how people did this on the front lines. You will discover that people made sacrifices, and you see that even happening now, making sacrifices to achieve greater productive output for their system, their mine, and whatever it is, in order to accelerate out of the crisis. But if you want to prevent that from going off the rails, going really wrong, creating fatalities, creating trade-offs at the organizational level that we wouldn't want to see, then the only way to predict that is to understand how people create success and understand the sacrifices they make in creating that success. Because it is in those sacrifices, some of which matter, many of which don't matter, it is in those sacrifices that the kernels, the seeds of greater trouble might well lie. And that you need to make as a topic of conversation and discovery and reflection and perhaps adjustment. But you can only do that with a mindset of appreciation of adaptive capacity, of frontline empowerment, and curiosity about how they did it.
Thanks, Sidney. I think excellent insight. And Michael, your closing thoughts?
For me, one of the key lessons out of all this has been trust. All those people have said that I'm not getting productivity out of people, or I can't trust them to work from home. Now they've learned that actually you can get greater productivity if you just trust people to work in a working from home environment. If we take that key lesson of trust, how do we start to trust our people? How do we engender that? And how do we continue to earn that trust from them? There's a lot of goodwill in organizations. And one of the myths of the debate that has gone on is people seem to think that an organization or a company is its management or leadership or officers. It's not. It's its people. That is what the organization is, and that's what has been shown through this crisis. And part of this is, one of the things that are going to come out of this is people are going to be interested in the resilience of an organization. We've seen a lot of innovation from various organizations through this, operationally, coming up with new ways of doing things, new ways of operating, despite the adversity that we've all seen. I wonder whether over time, the real test, the real value of an organization won't be based on its earnings or its EBITDA or some other financial measure, but will actually be in large part a measure of its resilience. Because if I was to invest some money, I'd want to invest it in an organization that's going to be around when the next 2 or 3 crises, disruptions and crises come up, rather than one that is going to fall victim to those things.
I think the stock market is going to be very interested in that.
I think that's exactly right.
Well, thanks, panel. We're just about to open it up to the floor, and we'll give you some instructions shortly about how to join the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time to join today's webinar. An email has just been sent to you with a link to an extended Q&A panel discussion that is happening right now. We'll be able to host the first 250 people who attend the live extended Q&A. If you miss out, don't worry. We'll be recording the extended panel discussion and we will send out the recording link to you so you can watch at a convenient time. Thanks again for joining today's webinar, and we hope you have found it helpful.